simply could not get that sort of insight into that caddy back and forth in that small parlor. And I left pages of it. I was so disappointed when I first read this document. I was like, oh my God, half of it's about that one night in a parlor in Kingston. You know? But having said that, she then goes on. There's 3 very short sections which follow this, which are in supposedly conversations with, I assume, her husband's regimental mates, describing their battle experiences. And again, I think that's them looking back on the Battle of Sackett's Harbor and what happened, because many of the events very closely match. And there, what I think we can see is a woman's version of how men describe masculinity, how men describe fear, how men describe their disgust at others that take the spoils of victory when they think they didn't earn them. In fact, how men construct heroism. There's a great deal there that, whether it's fact or fiction, still speaks to ideas common current at the time.
Maria, did you want to say that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I did have to leave out in putting all this together is that petitions are not, I mean, they may be true. But like anything else, these are very, I mean, Natalie Zeman Davis called it fiction in the archives, right? It's really specifically crafted narratives that people use in order to try to affect certain actions. So what these people are trying to do is they're trying to figure out, okay, what can I tell the lieutenant governor? What can I tell Congress that will make them go, well, those claims commissions that will pay me are clearly in the wrong, I should get money. And so they're going to tell the best story that they can. And so I've already found cases where of things that, you know, are actually completely false, that somebody else will write in the back of the envelope. This has been investigated. This woman's husband, you know, she says that he's been lame, but actually he hasn't been, because he was seen working at so-and-so's field on this day. But a lame husband, of course, would push forward a kind of petition. And so in many cases, there isn't any evidence whether or not these things were true. But the important thing is that these women, these men, thought that these stories were the ones that were going to get them results, which means that they're the stories that are most important.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
And 2 questions, if you will pardon me. Maria, you mentioned there were some women who fought in war, either themselves or dressed as men. Yes. So the question is, can you tell us anything about them? Were they all American?
All of the stories, actually no, I do not have all American stories. The one really great story I have, Sophia Johnson. No, I actually ran across a pamphlet published by Sophia Johnson in 1839, so it's outside of this first thing, and so anytime I'm talking about the first 10 years of the war, I can't talk about her. But this is a narrative that she wrote about her wicked stepmother. This is how it starts. It's the story of her wicked stepmother. Her stepmother was so horrible that when Sophia Johnson's brother went off to war, and then her stepmother got even worse, she, with the help of a neighbor, dressed as a man, went off to find her brother. And it was so good, so convincing as a man that her brother said, well, why don't you just enlist and we'll keep doing this. She fought in several battles. She was well, you know, according to her own story, she did very well. And then she was shot in the arm with a cannon. I think it was a cannon anyway. Like, after a while, all the medical problems get a little bit overwhelming. Anyways, her arm was injured severely during a battle. She was taken off to a neighbor's house. They redressed her as a woman and got the doctors in. They amputated her arm. So here we are, 30 years after the war, not quite 30 at this point, and she's broke, her brother's dead, and all of a sudden she needs to tell the story. And so we have the story of the one-armed woman who fought in the War of 1812. But she's not the only one I've found in this later stuff. Is everyone familiar with Lossing's pictorial field book to the War of 1812? It's one of those books that everyone knows about but never has read. I finally went through and read it. And because of what he was doing this whole travelogue type history. So he'd tell you a story, and then he'd take you there, because he traveled to all of the battle sites. He drew illustrations of all the battle sites, so that, kind of connecting past and present. And one of the things you find in his footnotes especially, is that he talked to people while he was there. And I've got at least one case off the top of my head, where he was talking to people about women in the area who had been on horseback when the soldiers came. I think this was a Canadian story, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I read this. Well, regardless, women were on horseback when the soldiers came and they fought on horseback. So we know that there are women who did this, but it's not the same. There isn't the level of documentation that we have about, say, the Civil War, women in the Civil War. There are so many of those that it's almost overwhelming. But Sophia Johnson's the only one I found so far who published her own.
So you have a second part to that question?
Yes, the phenomenon of petitions, it sounds as if it was quite a serious concern. And can you give us any idea of how dominant this social movement was, or this resettlement movement was, like how many petitions, size, population, and something like that, so we can give context how popular it was?
Oh, hugely. I mean, like I said, everyone had the right to petition, and a lot of people did. I have, just talking about the petitions that mention the War of 1812, I have, in this 10-year period, I have over 300 from New York that went to Congress, and many, many more in Upper Canada. Because at that point, in order to claim land that you've been granted as like a United Empire loyalist, you had to give your war record. So hundreds of petitions. Not all of them are this narrative. A lot of them are just, my husband died in the war. My husband died in the war. I died in the war. Something happened there. But yes, it was a very predominant thing because it was in a lot, and like I said, literally everyone sent petitions. I have a petition from the governor of New York trying to get out of his war debts, and I have a petition from a woman named Freelove Darby that I think she actually wrote herself, really poorly, very barely literate Upper Canadian housewife. Like literally the whole spectrum of society.
Good to know. There was another question over here. Yes.
I'd like to have you talk about Brock's fiance. I just purchased a book just a while ago in Fort York. Story about a little boy, orphan boy, historical fiction called Apple, and it mentions Brock's fiance. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Well, I can tell you, her name was Sophia Shaw. In 1817 or so, she was 22 years old. I have her birth certificate. There is literally, as far as I know, unless somebody wants to contradict me here, and if you find any evidence that this actually exists, there is literally no evidence that she had any connection to Brock whatsoever. Okay. Did you find some?
No, I haven't.
No, and I like
lots of letters between Shaw's sons and Brock. They knew each other.
Oh yes, of course they knew the families, and the families knew each other. It was a small place. But
when he talks about it really, really nicely, he gave recommendations and some, the only men in the army on his recommendations, they were very close.
Okay, so that's good to know. That is good to know, but the whole fiancé thing doesn't show up until a book called, it's one of the Heroes of Canada, The Story of Brock, written by Nursey in 1915. It's the first, as far as I can tell, and it's been looked at by, God, who else looked at it? Several other people have looked at it. That is the first documented instance of her being mentioned. And since then, she's turned into this whole story. On the way, galloping from Fort George down to the Queenston Heights, she stopped at their house and she gave him a stirrup of coffee. Obviously that coffee didn't do him much good.
Some marketer of coffee will surely pick up this story.
Do you look at all, take the stories, the petition stories from the War of 1812 and put them in the context of international war mythology?
Oh, some of them definitely, because lots of people like to compare themselves to the Greeks. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're always talking about the Greeks, the Romans, just like the Spartans and so in such a place. But actually, that doesn't come out as much in the petition stories. Because the petition stories, you have to remember, they're not very heroic. Because
You want to get into
well, yeah, well, no, and even more to the point, I was actually really surprised because I remember these petitions going, well, these guys, they're going to talk about how they charged up Queenston Heights with rock. Really, most of the time they talk about how when serving so valiantly, they lost their leg, and then it was so hard, and it was so hard. You know, they want to tell you, they make it a tragedy. Every one of these stories is a tragedy. You do see the comparisons in all the published material.
Yeah, because what I find interesting, I mean, there has to be certain stories of how you portray yourself as a victim, because that's what's happening here. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of a show that was on television when I was a child, that I would get to see if I was homesick, and that was called Queen for a Day. And you used to have 3 contestants each tell a story of woe, and then the audience would vote about who was the most miserable. They became queen for a day, and no one was thinking as you spoke.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of that. But, you know, it is, and I think in petitions later, I mean, even just looking at the 2 petitions of leurs, which I found the first one, you know, of course it's in the book, you know, Heroes in History, but the second one compared to the first one, there's a lot more narrative convention in the second one than the first one. And so looking at just the first 10 years, there's a lot of stories that had yet to be told. And so it's a lot of ad hoc stuff, a lot of neighbors are starting to put in petitions. But I think as time goes along, people got, you know, it's like, well, you got your petition. So what did you do that got your petition? Oh, you told that story. Yeah, so.
We still do this. It's called the art of grantsmanship. Lorna.
A question for Cindy, how are you going to represent these women in your commemoration?
Well, I will be tweaking a little bit more. There's more historical information than what I have in my talk today, and I'll be hoping to present this information again at this Apple Blossom Festival, which will take place on St. Joseph Island, to give a little bit more detail and background, in particular from Island. All of the information is collected from many resources that I've looked at over the last couple of months, so it'll become part of the collection both at the Retainer site and St. Joseph National Historic Site. And when I'm working with getting the stories out to the media, certainly the women's angle will be something that I'll be trying to kind of hand feed to get that information out there. And also, you know, we're looking very closely at any of the marketing materials that we're producing to make sure that any of the visuals we have, which are, you know, reenactors, photos, and that type of thing, that they do represent, you know, women, you know, First Nation, Métis, British, you know, that everybody is well represented across the board as well. So it'll be a matter of getting out there and having the talk available as well, so that other people can deliver it and take it out to other, you know, community organizations and that type of thing as well, because there are 2 stories that almost everybody in the Sioux knows everybody in the Sioux probably, hopefully, would know the Retainer Clerk and the National Historic Site, but they don't necessarily know the people behind it. And this is in my effort to, being an amateur historian, researcher, writer myself, I wanted to find some people that I could create an identity with the event, and this is my first venture in trying to do that.
So I think, the last question to Francis.
It's kind of a comment, but also a question for Maria. The war loss site, it's a long time since I looked at them. I still had a copy of Joseph Liddell's. And what's really interesting, of course, is that in that area, the losses are all because of the British soldiers, even though they're on the Canadian side. It's the British soldiers being in the area that caused the problems, because they were
same on the other side of the border too.
Yeah, and so it's that kind of thing. So it's just like, obviously you saw some of that. And the other thing was that whole thing about the female, the fragility and all of that kind of stuff. I'm just wondering if we pay more attention to that in women's petitions than we do in men's. Because men's petitions have and correspondence generally has a format. And And with the men's petitions and men's language, I wonder if we don't just ignore it and say it's not important. Whereas with the women's, we tend to look at it and say, well, you know, these are the expectations, but in actual fact, the women weren't like that. But could we also throw out, these were the expectations?
Yes,
And should we be working more from, well, this is what women were like?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, and that's actually something that I was in the first draft of this, and then I, asked it. The thing is that a lot, there are societal expectations on both sides. The way they play out are very different for men and women, but the language tends to be the same. Both sides, both men and women, no charity, can't have charity. But when it comes to things like illness and, and fragility in general, like physical fragility, a man had to explain why. I am sick because I was doing this, that, and the other thing. For a woman, it was enough to have been near the war to be fragile. So every woman put in their petition somewhere, I'm exaggerating slightly. Some of them didn't do this. In fact, some of the most interesting ones just gave up a